In the summer of 1943, while the world was engulfed in the battles of World War II, another kind of conflict was unfolding far from the front lines. This one was not fought with tanks or bombs, but with fists, fear, and prejudice. It happened in Los Angeles, a city that symbolized opportunity and freedom for many, yet beneath its surface lay tensions that had been simmering for years. These tensions would soon explode into what became known as the Zoot Suit Riots. Los Angeles in the early 1940s was a place of contrasts. On one hand, it was a booming city filled with defense industries, bustling neighborhoods, and a growing population drawn by the promise of wartime jobs. On the other hand, it was also a city divided by race, culture, and class. Among those who had made Los Angeles their home were thousands of Mexican-American families. Many of their sons served in the armed forces, fighting overseas for freedom. Others were teenagers, part of a new generation carving out an identity of their own. That identity was often expressed through fashion. The zoot suit, with its oversized jacket, padded shoulders, and flowing trousers, became the chosen style of these young men and women, often called pachucos and pachucas. To them, the suit was more than just clothing, it was a declaration of pride, of belonging, and of resistance to a society that often treated them as outsiders. But to many in the broader public, the zoot suit was seen differently. In the middle of wartime rationing, with fabric considered precious, wearing such extravagant outfits was viewed as wasteful, even unpatriotic. This clash of perspectives grew sharper with each passing day. Newspapers and radio stations fueled stereotypes, painting Mexican-American youths as troublemakers and gang members. The image of the zoot suit became tied to fear, to delinquency, and to crime in the public imagination. Servicemen stationed in Los Angeles, already restless and far from the battlefields, saw in these young men a challenge, a target, and a symbol of defiance. And so, the stage was set. In June 1943, a spark would ignite, turning simmering tensions into days of open violence. Servicemen roamed the streets in groups, stripping young men of their zoot suits, beating them, and leaving them humiliated. Police often looked the other way, or even arrested the very victims of these attacks. What began as isolated incidents quickly spiraled into a citywide eruption, leaving scars that would not easily fade. This is not just the story of a riot. It is the story of a moment in history when identity, prejudice, and power collided on the streets of Los Angeles. It is a reminder that battles for justice are not only fought overseas but also at home, within our own neighborhoods and communities. If you find this story meaningful, and if you'd like to join us in uncovering more hidden histories that shape the world we live in today, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Your support helps us continue shining light on stories that should never be forgotten. And as always, thank you for watching, and may your evening be peaceful. In the early 1940s, Los Angeles was alive with sound, color, and the constant rhythm of a city in motion. Jazz and swing filled the nightclubs, neon lights glowed across the streets, and young people looked for ways to define themselves in a rapidly changing world. Among them was a group of Mexican-American youths who found their expression in a style unlike anything else at the time. Their choice of fashion was bold, defiant, and unforgettable, the zoot suit. To outsiders, it may have looked extravagant. Long, wide-shouldered jackets that draped almost to the knees, trousers cut high and billowing, often tapering into sharp cuffs, and wide-brimmed hats tilted with a certain flair. It wasn't just clothing, it was performance, a statement that could not be ignored. To wear a zoot suit was to step onto the stage of everyday life with confidence, daring anyone to look away. For these young people, often called pachucos and pachucas, the zoot suit was more than fabric stitched together. It was identity. Many of them grew up in working-class neighborhoods, children of immigrant families, caught between cultures. On one side was the heritage of their parents, rich with tradition and history. On the other side was the pressure of assimilation, the expectation to blend into a society that didn't always welcome them. In this space between worlds, the zoot suit became a bridge, a flag of belonging to something uniquely their own. When a young man walked down the street in such a suit, he wasn't simply dressed for the day, he was sending a message. He was declaring that he mattered, that his presence could not be erased or ignored. For many, the suit embodied pride in being part of a culture that was vibrant, resilient, and unafraid of standing out. The dance halls, where swing music pulsed and couples spun across the floor, became stages where this pride was displayed most vividly. The zoot suit moved with the music, amplifying every spin, every step, every stomp of defiance. Yet while the pachucos and pachucas embraced this style as a symbol of confidence and self-respect, not everyone saw it that way. America during World War II was a place of scarcity. Fabric was rationed. Every inch of wool or cotton was counted toward uniforms, blankets, and supplies meant for soldiers overseas. To many, the wide, flowing cuts of a zoot suit seemed like a direct challenge to these sacrifices. It wasn't just fashion, it was seen as an insult, a refusal to follow the rules during a time when everyone was expected to give something up. The image of the zoot suit began to shift in the eyes of the broader public. What was pride to one group became provocation to another. Headlines in newspapers painted the wearers as troublemakers, as criminals lurking in alleys, as rebels against the war effort itself. With each article, the myth grew stronger: the zoot suit wasn't just a garment, it was a threat. This perception festered, feeding into long-standing prejudices against Mexican Americans and other communities of color. For servicemen stationed in Los Angeles, far from the front lines but surrounded by wartime tension, the sight of these flamboyant suits felt like a taunt. Here they were, preparing for battle, sacrificing comforts, and watching their friends ship off overseas, while a group of young men seemed to strut through the streets untouched by the weight of war. The resentment grew, transforming into a sense of rivalry. In dance halls, in theaters, in downtown streets, glances turned into stares, stares into insults, and insults into fights. But it would be too simple to say this conflict was only about fabric and fashion. Beneath the surface, the zoot suit became a lightning rod for something much larger, a struggle over who belonged in America and who did not. Mexican American youths claimed their space through style, refusing to shrink into invisibility. Those who opposed them used the rationing excuse as justification for their hostility, masking deeper fears and biases. The zoot suit was not the cause, it was the spark that revealed the dry kindling of prejudice already piled high. Every flowing jacket, every swing of fabric, every tilted hat brim carried this weight of symbolism. To wear one was to risk judgment, harassment, even violence. Yet young men and women continued to wear them, precisely because the suit had taken on such meaning. To abandon it would be to accept invisibility. To wear it was to demand recognition, even in the face of hostility. And so, what might have remained simply a fashion choice became something far greater. The zoot suit embodied a cultural battle over dignity, identity, and belonging. In every stitch of fabric and every exaggerated silhouette, it told the story of youth demanding to be seen, of communities fighting against erasure, and of a nation wrestling with its own contradictions. This was not just clothing. This was a banner. A silent but undeniable shout: we are here, and we will not be forgotten. Los Angeles in the early 1940s was a city of rapid growth, shimmering lights, and promises of opportunity. Factories roared with the sounds of wartime production, and the streets buzzed with energy as people from every corner of the country, and beyond, poured in, searching for work and a better life. But beneath this image of prosperity and unity lay another story, one less glamorous, one rooted in distrust and division. For Mexican Americans, who had long been a part of Southern California's fabric, daily life was a constant balancing act between visibility and exclusion. Prejudice had been present long before the war. Mexican laborers were essential to California's fields, railroads, and industries, yet their contributions were often met with dismissal. Segregation was woven into everyday routines, schools separated children, neighborhoods were divided by invisible lines, and signs in restaurants or theaters made clear who was welcome and who was not. Even as generations of families called Los Angeles home, they were frequently treated as outsiders, reminders of a border that, for them, had never truly disappeared. As the United States entered World War II, these divisions deepened. Wartime anxieties magnified old fears. Suddenly, everything became a question of loyalty, of sacrifice, of whether one's actions aligned with the national cause. Citizens were expected to prove their patriotism in every choice they made, from how much food they consumed, to how they worked, to even what they wore. For communities already marginalized, the pressure was doubly heavy. Mexican Americans found themselves scrutinized in ways their white neighbors were not. Their presence in certain neighborhoods, their gatherings in dance halls, even their language became points of suspicion. The irony was stark. Many young Mexican American men enlisted, fighting bravely on distant battlefields under the American flag. Yet, back home, their brothers and sisters faced suspicion, whispers, and cold stares. In some cases, servicemen returned from overseas only to find that their families had been harassed, their communities labeled as troublesome. The sacrifice abroad did not shield them from prejudice at home. This sense of mistrust was not born overnight. It had been nurtured over decades through stereotypes spread in newspapers, caricatures in films, and biased reports from local officials. The Mexican American youth, especially those who embraced bold cultural identities, were cast as unruly, unwilling to conform, and prone to trouble. The war simply gave new fuel to these portrayals. Now, under the lens of national duty, their individuality looked to some like defiance, their confidence mistaken for disrespect. The fear that hovered over the city during wartime did not affect all groups equally. Scarcity of resources and the stress of watching loved ones go off to war created an atmosphere of unease. In this climate, small differences became magnified. The sound of Spanish spoken in the street could stir suspicion. A gathering of young people in vibrant attire might be perceived as a challenge to authority. What might have once been dismissed as youthful energy now appeared, in the tense imagination of some, as a sign of rebellion. These anxieties seeped into everyday interactions. A bus ride, a trip to the market, or a night at the movies could become arenas for quiet hostility. Side glances, muttered comments, or deliberate acts of exclusion chipped away at the promise of equality that many believed the war was supposed to defend. Instead of unity, the city saw the lines between communities grow sharper, the divisions harder to ignore. And yet, within Mexican American neighborhoods, resilience thrived. Families leaned on one another, preserving traditions, music, and language. Dance halls echoed with swing and jazz as young men and women created spaces of joy, places where they could momentarily escape the constant scrutiny. But these very spaces of celebration often became targets of resentment. To some outsiders, the sight of Mexican American youths enjoying themselves in a time of war was intolerable. Fun was misinterpreted as negligence, pride mistaken for arrogance. It is within this climate that the seeds of conflict were sown. The long history of prejudice created a foundation of mistrust, and the war's demand for conformity poured fuel on the fire. Social divisions, which might have remained simmering beneath the surface, now rose to the forefront, visible in every street corner and newspaper headline. The city's vibrant diversity, instead of being celebrated, became a battleground for defining who was truly American and who was not. This tension would not remain abstract. It would find its outlet in confrontations, in violence, in the targeting of those who dared to stand out. What began as whispered prejudices and sidelong glances grew into full-scale hostilities, shaking the city to its core. And through it all, Mexican-American communities carried the weight of being both part of the nation's war effort and yet, in the eyes of many, forever marked as outsiders. The story of these divisions is not only about conflict, it is about resilience in the face of exclusion, about the courage to maintain identity even when the world demanded silence. It reminds us that prejudice is never just about isolated acts, but about systems and stories that stretch across generations, shaping how entire communities are seen, and how they see themselves. In the 1940s, newspapers and radio held tremendous power. For many families in Los Angeles, the daily paper was more than ink on pages, it was the lens through which they understood their city and their neighbors. Headlines shaped opinions, photographs etched images into memory, and stories whispered rumors that quickly hardened into truths. For Mexican-American youths, especially those who wore the bold and unforgettable zoot suits, this influence was rarely kind. Each morning, the press painted a picture that cast shadows over an entire community. Articles described young men gathering on street corners not as friends talking or waiting for a ride, but as threatening groups, prowling and restless. Ordinary social interactions were twisted into narratives of danger. The playful laughter of teenagers in dance halls was reimagined as scheming. A neighborhood party might be written about as a disturbance, a menace to the peace. Bit by bit, these words piled up until the image of Mexican-American youth became inseparable, in the public imagination, from crime and delinquency. The power of these stories lay not only in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. Rarely did the newspapers highlight the contributions of Mexican-American families to the war effort, or the bravery of soldiers with Spanish surnames serving overseas. Rarely did they mention the long hours worked in factories, fields, and shipyards, labor that kept the city alive and the war machine turning. Instead, the spotlight focused narrowly on moments of conflict, exaggerating them into proof of widespread lawlessness. It wasn't only the words that mattered, it was the tone. Phrases were sharpened like knives, crafted to stir fear in readers. A minor altercation between young people could be framed as the work of gangs. A scuffle in a theater became evidence of organized crime. Through repetition, these stories did something even more damaging: they made stereotypes feel familiar, even logical. For those who had never set foot in a Mexican-American neighborhood, the only picture they saw was the one painted in black and white newsprint. And so, the stage was set for misunderstanding. The image of the zoot suit itself, a garment of style, pride, and identity, was transformed in the headlines into a symbol of menace. Wide-legged trousers and long jackets became visual shorthand for criminality. A fashion statement worn by teenagers who wanted to dance, to stand out, to express themselves, was rebranded as the uniform of disorder. Every time a photograph of a young man in a zoot suit appeared alongside a crime report, the association deepened. For the youths themselves, the gap between reality and reputation was crushing. Imagine being a teenager, stepping out in your best suit, feeling proud of who you are, only to see the next day's paper describe someone like you as a public threat. Imagine your parents, who sacrificed so much for stability, reading words that painted their children as dangerous, even when their greatest crime was dancing too late into the night. This narrative did not just wound individuals, it cast suspicion across entire neighborhoods. The consequences stretched far beyond the printed page. When the public consumed these stories, fear took root. Shopkeepers eyed young customers with suspicion. Policemen approached with harsher tones. Teachers carried assumptions into classrooms. These biases, fed daily by media portrayals, shaped interactions, shaping how an entire generation was treated. What began as words in print became experiences in flesh and blood. Meanwhile, the press rarely questioned its role. Sensational headlines sold papers. Stories of crime and scandal caught attention in a way that quiet accounts of family life or community pride could not. In choosing drama over balance, the media built a narrative that served its own interests, not the truth. And once built, this narrative was hard to tear down. Even when individuals rose to prove their worth, serving in the military, excelling in school, working tirelessly in factories, the shadow of those headlines followed them. For servicemen stationed in Los Angeles, reading these newspapers only reinforced their biases. Many came from towns where Mexican Americans were strangers, not neighbors. When they arrived and saw young men in zoot suits walking the streets, the image they carried in their minds was already colored by the articles they had read. They were primed to see a threat, long before any actual conflict occurred. This cycle, media portrayal, public perception, real-world consequences, became a trap that Mexican American youths could not easily escape. To walk proudly in a zoot suit was to risk confirming the very stereotypes the press had created. To abandon it, to disappear into conformity, felt like surrendering one's identity. In this way, the headlines of the 1940s did more than inform. They boxed an entire community into a story they had not chosen for themselves. Looking back, it is clear how powerful words can be. The newspapers of that era did not merely report events, they constructed a narrative that justified suspicion, hostility, and eventually violence. What might have been seen as youthful expression was instead cast as criminal rebellion. What could have been celebrated as cultural pride was instead marked as a threat to order. And yet, within this struggle, a different story endured. The young men and women who continued to wear their suits, to dance, to gather, were pushing back against more than prejudice. They were resisting the weight of a narrative designed to silence them. Every headline that sought to diminish them only gave greater importance to their determination to stand tall. Their existence itself became an act of defiance, a refusal to let the press define who they were. It began with something that could have been dismissed as just another late-night altercation. A few sharp words, a shove, a fist thrown in anger. In any other time, it might have ended there, remembered only by those who were present. But Los Angeles in the summer of 1943 was not just any place, and the young men who clashed were not just random passers-by. On one side were servicemen, young sailors far from the war front, restless, frustrated, and fueled by alcohol. On the other were Mexican-American youths, often dressed in their bold zoot suits, standing together in the neighborhoods where they lived and worked. What unfolded that night did not stay confined to the sidewalks where it began. The fight lit a spark that ignited a powder keg of resentment, prejudice, and simmering hostility that had been building for years. By the time the first punches were thrown, the city was already primed for violence. And when news of the scuffle spread, it was no longer seen as a brawl between individuals, it became a symbol, a rallying cry for those who believed that these young Mexican Americans embodied everything threatening about the changing face of Los Angeles. The servicemen who had arrived in the city brought with them not only the discipline of the military but also the restlessness of men trained for combat yet far from the battlefields. They were celebrated as heroes, symbols of patriotism, and their presence was met with gratitude and admiration by many residents. But beneath that image of honor was a volatile mix of frustration and boredom. Night after night, they roamed the city in search of excitement, often ending up in bars, theaters, and dance halls where the paths of servicemen and local youths crossed. For the Mexican-American teenagers, the zoot suit was a uniform of its own. It wasn't about warfare, but about pride. To them, it was a way to be seen in a world that preferred to ignore them. But to the servicemen, conditioned by media stories that linked zoot suits with gangs and crime, the sight of those broad shoulders and flowing trousers felt like an open challenge. The suit became more than fabric, it became a dividing line. When fists flew, they carried more than personal anger. Each blow became a strike against the other side's identity, their very sense of belonging. A scuffle between two groups of young men quickly transformed into a narrative of us versus them. And once the line was drawn, others rushed to join. More servicemen gathered, some eager to prove themselves, others simply swept up in the momentum. Mexican-American youths called for support from their friends, determined not to back down. Within hours, what began as a fight had swollen into something far larger, and far more dangerous. Word spread like wildfire. Crowds formed, first as onlookers, then as participants. Servicemen marched through neighborhoods, their numbers growing, their tempers unchecked. Mexican-American youths tried to defend themselves, but they were vastly outnumbered and facing not only fists but belts, clubs, and whatever weapons the servicemen could find. The violence spilled into restaurants, theaters, and streets. Young men were dragged out, stripped of their zoot suits, humiliated in front of cheering onlookers. The police, instead of calming the chaos, often deepened it. Officers arrested victims rather than attackers, their biases sharpened by years of seeing Mexican-American youth through the distorted lens of the press. Servicemen were allowed to continue their rampage while those targeted were locked away, their dignity stolen twice, once in the streets, and again in the station house. As the violence spread, the atmosphere of the city shifted. What started as a single fight now looked like a campaign. For many servicemen, it was framed as restoring order, as though stripping young men of their suits and leaving them bloodied on the pavement somehow protected the nation. For the youths, it was a nightmare come to life, the confirmation of every fear their parents had whispered about how little protection their community could expect. The city's neighborhoods became battlegrounds. Families huddled inside their homes, listening to shouts and chaos outside. Mothers prayed that their sons would make it home safely, while fathers stood guard at their doors, knowing they could do little against mobs that seemed sanctioned by the very authorities sworn to keep the peace. By the time the violence began to ebb, the damage was done. The scuffle that had sparked it all had become the justification for nights of brutality. And in the aftermath, the story told in newspapers was not of servicemen attacking unarmed youths, but of gangs being taught a lesson. The truth was buried beneath a narrative shaped to protect the powerful and blame the powerless. That first fight, small in scale but enormous in consequence, had revealed just how fragile the peace in Los Angeles truly was. It showed how quickly long-standing prejudice, combined with wartime stress and sensational media portrayals, could turn a city's streets into battlegrounds. And most of all, it exposed the deep fault lines of identity and belonging, fault lines that would not disappear when the fist stopped flying, but instead would echo for generations. At first, it looked like a group of men simply making their way through the city streets. Sailors in uniform, their white hats catching the glow of street lamps, walked shoulder to shoulder down the boulevards of Los Angeles. But these were not aimless strolls. They were organized hunts, and their targets were clear, anyone bold enough to wear the unmistakable silhouette of a zoot suit. What began as a single altercation had shifted into something much larger, a nightly ritual that carried an air of menace. Servicemen, many from the U.S. Navy but joined by soldiers and Marines, left their barracks with a singular mission. They combed the streets, stepping into crowded theaters, wandering into dance halls, and barging into cafes. Wherever they went, they searched for the long coats, wide trousers, and exaggerated hats that had become symbols of youthful defiance. The moment they spotted one, the chase began. A young man might be pulled from a bench where he had been chatting with friends, or dragged from a movie seat before the credits rolled. Some were stopped mid-step in front of their own homes. To the servicemen, the zoot suit was not just a fashion statement, it was a mark of disrespect. They saw it as wasteful in a time of wartime rationing, and more than that, they had come to associate it with delinquency. Fueled by stories that painted Mexican-American youths as criminals, the sight of a suit was enough to set them off. Once caught, the assaults followed a humiliating script. The youths were stripped of their jackets, their baggy trousers, their hats torn from their heads. The clothing, carefully chosen to reflect cultural pride, was reduced to rags in the gutter. Some were left bruised and battered on the pavement, their voices drowned out by the roar of cheering crowds. For onlookers who sided with the servicemen, this was a spectacle. They laughed, pointed, even clapped, treating the violence as if it were entertainment. The Navy men rarely worked alone. Their numbers gave them confidence, and their uniforms gave them a sense of impunity. Moving in groups of dozens, they poured through neighborhoods, each corner they turned leaving behind a trail of fear. In some areas, families shut their windows tight, hoping the sound of their radios would mask the footsteps outside. Mothers warned their sons to stay indoors, but even that offered no guarantee. If a serviceman thought he saw a zoot suit inside a home, sometimes doors were kicked open, and young men were dragged out into the streets. The attacks were not about crime prevention. They were not about safety. They were about control, about reminding a community where power truly rested. And yet, the servicemen insisted they were restoring order, convinced that stripping teenagers of their clothing somehow protected the city. In reality, the violence created only more chaos. Night after night, fear rippled through Los Angeles, especially in Mexican-American neighborhoods where the suits had been most proudly worn. Police presence did little to stop the roaming bands. In many cases, officers looked the other way or, worse, arrested the very victims who had been beaten. When servicemen returned to their bases, they rarely faced consequences. The uniform they wore shielded them from accountability, while those left battered on the streets were branded as troublemakers. The imbalance was glaring, one group empowered by the state, the other treated as outsiders in their own city. As the days stretched into nights of repeated raids, the scale of the violence grew. It was no longer isolated attacks but waves of servicemen moving together, sometimes traveling by taxi, other times piling into trucks to reach the next block, the next neighborhood, the next group of unsuspecting youths. The city became a hunting ground, and the prey were not criminals but boys whose only offense was the clothing they wore and the culture they represented. For many who lived through it, the memory of those nights was not just about physical pain but about the humiliation that lingered long after the bruises faded. The Zoot Suit had been more than a style, it was a badge of identity, a way of declaring existence in a world that often ignored them. To be stripped of it publicly was to be told, in the most violent way possible, that their pride had no place in the city they called home. The servicemen returned to their bases each night with a sense of victory, their laughter echoing as if they had won a battle. But the battlefield they left behind was filled not with enemies vanquished, but with neighbors broken and dignity stolen. Families patched up wounds, comforted shaken sons, and wondered how much longer the city would allow this madness to continue. In those June nights of 1943, the streets of Los Angeles bore witness to something deeper than mere brawls. They revealed the raw edges of prejudice, the power of uniforms to embolden cruelty, and the ease with which ordinary young men could transform into mobs when hatred was given permission to roam unchecked. And for those who wore the Zoot Suit, every night became a test of survival, their very identity turned into a target for violence. The streets of Los Angeles in June 1943 carried an uneasy rhythm. By day, the city seemed alive with the pulse of wartime industry, ships being built, uniforms filling train stations, factories buzzing with workers. But by night, a different rhythm took over, boots pounding the pavement, shouts echoing through alleyways, and the thud of fists and belts against flesh. The violence that unfolded during those nights did not stop at one community. Though Mexican-American youths bore the brunt of the attacks, they were not the only ones marked by the wave of hostility. African Americans, Filipino Americans, and others who dared to wear the wrong clothes, walk in the wrong neighborhood, or simply look different enough found themselves swept into the storm. What began as a campaign against young men in Zoot Suits quickly bled into a broader campaign of intimidation against anyone who did not fit the narrow image of what it meant to belong. For the servicemen roaming the streets, it mattered little whether their targets had ever picked a fight or broken a law. The uniform of identity, dark skin, distinctive fashion, cultural pride, was enough to make someone a victim. In some neighborhoods, African American youths leaving dance halls were cornered, their laughter silenced by sudden violence. In others, Filipino American workers finishing long shifts were stopped on their way home, beaten not for anything they had done, but simply for being present in the wrong place at the wrong time. The city itself seemed to turn into a stage where cruelty played out in public view. Crowds gathered not just to watch, but to cheer, as if the stripping of a Zoot Suit or the beating of a young man were entertainment rather than injustice. Strangers who had nothing to do with the initial altercations were pulled into the chaos, swept into a narrative that labeled them as troublemakers simply because of the communities they came from. For Mexican-American families, the terror was constant. Mothers sat awake through the night, listening for footsteps outside, praying their sons would return home safely. Fathers stood guard on porches, knowing they could do little against groups of uniformed men who carried the weight of authority with them. Yet they were not alone in their fear. African American families told the same stories, of young men dragged from street corners, of neighbors who never came home from an evening stroll. Filipino American families whispered warnings to one another, urging caution, though no amount of caution seemed enough. The violence did not discriminate in its cruelty, but it did reveal the fragile bonds that tied these communities together. In the face of attacks, solidarity grew quietly. Neighbors offered shelter to those being hunted, shared information about which streets to avoid, and tended to bruises and wounds in the safety of kitchens and living rooms. Though the newspapers painted the story as one of delinquent youth, those who lived through it knew the truth: the victims were not criminals, but sons, brothers, friends, young people whose lives had been interrupted by hatred. One evening, a group of Filipino-American laborers, still in their work clothes, found themselves cornered near a bus stop. They had no zoot suits, no flashy attire, just tired faces and calloused hands. Yet the servicemen saw them as no different from the others. They were beaten, their belongings scattered, their dignity stripped away. Across town, African-American teenagers walking home from a dance met the same fate. The common thread was not what they wore, but who they were, and how the attackers saw them. These stories repeated night after night, each one echoing the same lesson, that identity itself had become a target. The violence was not about fashion, nor even about wartime rationing. It was about power and prejudice, played out on the bodies of those least able to defend themselves. And still, resilience grew from the cracks. Communities rallied together, not in open confrontation, they knew the risks were too great, but in quiet acts of defiance. They helped one another heal, shared meals when families were too shaken to leave their homes, and whispered to their children that, no matter how the world treated them, they still belonged. By the end of those turbulent nights, the list of victims stretched across cultures and neighborhoods, weaving a tragic tapestry of shared suffering. Mexican-American youths were at the center, but the pain extended far beyond, touching African-American and Filipino-American communities in ways that would not be forgotten. For Los Angeles, those weeks became a dark mirror, reflecting the city's deepest divisions. It was not just one group under attack, but a broader challenge to the very idea of diversity and belonging. The servicemen returned to their bases, perhaps believing they had made their point. But for those left behind, the scars, both visible and invisible, told a different story, one of communities united not by choice, but by shared trauma in the face of unchecked violence. The memory of those nights lingers not just because of the brutality, but because of the breadth of its reach. It was a reminder that injustice rarely confines itself to one boundary, one neighborhood, or one people. When hate is allowed to roam free, it spreads, sweeping up anyone who stands outside the narrow frame of acceptance. In 1943 Los Angeles, that truth was carved into the lives of Mexican Americans, African Americans, Filipino Americans, and many others, each bearing witness to a city unraveling under the weight of its own divisions. When the chaos spilled into the streets of Los Angeles, many believed that the police would step in to restore calm. Sirens wailed, patrol cars arrived, and for a fleeting moment there was hope that order might return. But what happened next shattered that hope. Instead of stopping the roaming bands of servicemen, the police turned their attention to the very people being attacked. Young Mexican Americans, already bruised and shaken from assaults, suddenly found themselves pushed against walls, handcuffed, and shoved into the back seats of police cars. Their voices, still trembling from the violence they had endured, were ignored. To the officers, these youths were not victims, they were suspects, embodiments of the same stereotypes that newspapers had been shouting for months. The scene repeated itself over and over. A group of sailors stripped a teenager of his zoot suit, leaving him half-dressed and bloodied in the gutter. When police arrived, they did not chase after the attackers. Instead, they pulled the young man to his feet, accused him of disturbing the peace, and marched him away under the glow of street lamps, while his tormentors melted back into the night with smirks on their faces. For families watching from their doorways, the message was unmistakable: protection was not coming. Mothers who had once told their sons to find safety near the police now wept as they saw those same officers leading their children away in handcuffs. Fathers clenched their fists in silence, forced to swallow their anger, knowing that any protest might bring further punishment. The servicemen seemed to understand this dynamic all too well. Their uniforms acted as shields. They could march in large groups, dragging young men out of restaurants or pulling them from movie theaters, and feel little fear of consequences. If the police appeared, it was not to stop them but to gather the wreckage they left behind, the dazed and battered youths, treated as criminals for daring to exist in their own neighborhoods. Each arrest deepened the wound. The press was quick to report the numbers, dozens of troublemakers locked up each night. But missing from those headlines were the details, the swollen lips, the broken ribs, the humiliation of being arrested moments after being beaten. The narrative became twisted, painting servicemen as keepers of order and Mexican-American youths as lawless agitators, even as the evidence lay in plain sight. The betrayal cut deeply. For many in the community, the police were supposed to be neutral, guardians of the peace. Yet in practice, they became enforcers of prejudice, reinforcing the very divisions that fueled the violence. A young man could walk into a police station seeking protection and walk out with charges against his name. Families who hoped to find justice in the courts instead discovered walls of indifference, where the word of a sailor outweighed the testimony of a teenager with brown skin. And still, the arrests continued. Holding cells filled with young men whose greatest crime was their appearance. Some had been dragged from parties, others from street corners, still others from the safety of their own porches. They sat in silence behind bars, trading stories of how the night had turned against them, wondering if anyone beyond their families cared enough to hear the truth. The fear spread quickly. In Mexican-American neighborhoods, parents warned their children not only about sailors but about the police themselves. "Stay inside," they whispered, "because if the mob doesn't get you, the police will." It was a chilling realization that there was no safe space, no authority to trust. Those sworn to serve and protect had chosen sides, and they had not chosen theirs. This dynamic did more than intensify the violence, it legitimized it. Each arrest sent a signal that the attacks were justified, that the servicemen were doing what the police themselves could not or would not. The line between law and lawlessness blurred, and in that gray space, injustice thrived. Looking back, the images are haunting. Sailors striding confidently down streets, emboldened by the knowledge that their actions carried little risk. Police wagons filled with young men who had begged for help but instead found themselves branded as criminals. Courtrooms where the scales of justice tipped heavily against those who most needed fairness. The Zoot Suit Riots were not only about fists, belts, and torn clothing. They were also about the machinery of authority, how it could be turned against the vulnerable instead of protecting them. The violence in the streets was shocking, but the silence and complicity of those in uniform gave it legitimacy. For the youths who lived through those nights, the lesson was unforgettable. They learned that justice was not blind. It looked away when they were attacked, and it focused sharply when it came time to assign blame. The memory of being both victim and accused at the same time became a scar that stayed long after the bruises healed. And in that scar lay the clearest truth of all. In June of 1943, the greatest betrayal was not only the mobs roaming the streets, but the failure of those who should have stopped them. The police, instead of breaking the cycle of violence, became part of it, locking away the attacked and letting the attackers walk free. By the second week of June 1943, Los Angeles no longer felt like a city at all. It felt like a battlefield. Crowds roamed the streets at night, neighborhoods trembled under the threat of sudden raids, and families lived in fear that the knock at the door would come for them. The newspapers called it unrest, the public whispered it was chaos, but to those living in the heart of it, the city seemed to be unraveling completely. And then, just as suddenly as it had ignited, the violence began to lose its momentum, not because of conscience, but because of command. The U.S. military, watching the headlines grow more troubling by the day, could no longer ignore what was happening. Servicemen in uniform, meant to represent discipline and honor, were instead being seen as the very source of disorder. The image of sailors dragging youths into the streets and tearing their clothing apart was spreading far beyond Los Angeles, and with it came the fear of scandal. Behind closed doors, military officials debated what to do. Arrests had done little, the police had proven either unwilling or unable to stem the tide. Each night the cycle repeated itself, young men in uniform leaving their bases, swarming into the city, and returning with stories of victory as if they had fought a war rather than assaulted unarmed teenagers. For the military leadership, it was clear, if the servicemen could not control themselves, then Los Angeles itself had to be taken away from them. The order came swiftly, Los Angeles was to be declared off-limits. No more Liberty nights in the bars of downtown. No more theater outings, no more roaming through East Side neighborhoods in search of Zoot Suiters. The city that had once been their playground was suddenly forbidden ground. For some servicemen, the news was met with anger. They had come to view their raids as a kind of sport, a twisted pastime to fill the long hours away from combat. Being told they could no longer step foot in Los Angeles felt like a punishment. Yet for others, perhaps, the order was a relief, a chance to escape the madness, to put an end to something that had spiraled out of control. On the streets, the impact was immediate. The groups of sailors who had once marched confidently through neighborhoods vanished almost overnight. The mobs, stripped of their military backbone, began to dissolve. Where once there had been shouting, jeering crowds, now there was only an uneasy silence. Families stepped cautiously out of their homes, blinking against the daylight, unsure whether the nightmare had truly ended. The city itself seemed to breathe for the first time in weeks. Cafes reopened their doors without fear of being stormed. Dance halls filled again with music, though the laughter carried a nervous edge. Mothers allowed their sons to walk down the street without clinging to their sleeves, though their eyes still darted at every passing shadow. The declaration had not erased the memory of what had happened, but it had at least broken the cycle. For officials, the move was presented as an act of control, a restoration of order. They framed it as necessary for the city's stability, as though the violence had been a storm blown in from nowhere rather than the product of years of prejudice and hostility. Yet for the communities who had endured the worst of it, the declaration carried a different meaning. It was proof, at last, that the attackers were not beyond accountability, that their actions were seen as dangerous enough to warrant restriction. Still, questions lingered. Why had it taken so long? Why had the servicemen been free to terrorize neighborhoods for days before the order came? And why was the solution to remove the attackers from the city, rather than to seek justice for those who had been beaten, humiliated, and jailed? The declaration may have calmed the streets, but it did not heal the wounds. In kitchens and living rooms, conversations turned to what came next. Young men compared scars, physical and otherwise, and wondered if their arrests would follow them into adulthood. Parents debated whether to keep their families in Los Angeles or seek a future elsewhere, in places where their children might not be hunted for their appearance. The fear remained, tucked into every glance at a police officer, every encounter with a stranger in uniform. The city's newspapers shifted their focus, but the memories clung stubbornly to those who had lived them. The military's declaration had put an end to the violence, but it had not erased the truth. For a brief and terrifying stretch of days, servicemen who wore the nation's uniform had been allowed to terrorize their fellow citizens. The promise of protection had been shattered, and no off-limits order could stitch it back together. In the end, the moment stood as both an ending and a revelation. The riots were over, but the prejudices that fueled them still lingered, waiting for the next spark. The silence on the streets was deceptive. It was not peace, but pause. And though the military's order had finally returned order to Los Angeles, it could not restore the trust that had been lost, nor erase the shadows left behind in the hearts of those who had endured those nights. When the dust settled and the city streets of Los Angeles returned to their uneasy rhythm, the echoes of the riots lingered like smoke after a fire. For those who lived through those turbulent nights, the memory was not just of violence, but of revelation. The clashes had pulled back a curtain, exposing to the world what many communities had always known, that beneath the glamour of Hollywood and the promise of the American dream lay deep fractures, sharpened by prejudice and fear. The riots were not merely about fashion or youthful rebellion. They were about the battle over who belonged, who had the right to stand tall and be seen, and who would be silenced or pushed aside. The zoot suit, with its exaggerated lines and bold presence, became more than fabric stitched together. It became a mirror reflecting the anxieties of a nation that preached unity abroad while practicing division at home. Young men and women who had embraced their cultural pride found themselves targeted not because of any crime, but because their very existence challenged the boundaries of acceptance. They carried the weight of generations who had long been treated as outsiders, and in their bright suits and defiant dances, they declared themselves visible. The backlash was swift, brutal, and unforgettable. Yet it also revealed a truth that could no longer be hidden. America's struggle with race and identity was not confined to the South or the past, it was alive in the heart of Los Angeles, and it demanded to be acknowledged. As the years passed, the riots came to symbolize more than a moment of fear. They stood as a reminder of resilience. The communities who bore the brunt of the violence refused to be erased. They painted their stories on walls, sang them in music, and wrote them into history, ensuring that the memory would survive even when the mainstream sought to bury it. Artists reclaimed the imagery of the Zoot Suit, turning it into a symbol of pride rather than shame. Activists drew strength from the courage of those who had endured the riots, connecting their struggles to the broader fight for equality. Even today, the lessons of 1943 remain painfully relevant. The riots show us how quickly fear can be twisted into hostility, how easily stereotypes can be weaponized, and how fragile justice becomes when prejudice shapes the narrative. But they also remind us that culture is powerful, that identity cannot be stripped away, and that voices once silenced will always find a way to rise again. To remember the Zoot Suit Riots is to confront both the pain and the possibility of America. It is to acknowledge that progress is often born in struggle, and that the fight for dignity and belonging is far from over. Every retelling of this story carries within it a call, to see one another fully, to reject the easy lies of stereotypes, and to stand firm against the currents of discrimination that still ripple through our world. So as we close this chapter tonight, let us not think of it as a story buried in history, but as a living reminder. A reminder that identity is worth defending, that justice must be pursued even when it feels out of reach, and that every generation has a responsibility to ensure the mistakes of the past are not repeated. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the hidden truths of our past. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so that more voices can be part of this conversation. Together, we keep history alive. And until the next story, good night, and sleep well.